Good morning, everybody. This is Susan Connor from the Early Intervention Training Program, and I just wanted to welcome you to our Wednesday morning webinar. Today's topic is talking with parents about challenging behavior, how to get started and work collaboratively to problem solve. We're thrilled to have with us today Michaelene Ostrosky and Santos from the University of Illinois. For any of you who have participated in the behavior webinar around transitions or the behavior webinar around sleep troubles, Mickey and Ami were our presenters for those webinars as well. In addition, we have Yusuf Akamoglu, who helped with putting together this presentation, but unfortunately you won't get to hear his voice today as he had other commitments this morning, but we wanted to recognize him. Also, today's moderators will be myself, Susan Connor, the Assistant Director of the Training Program, and Maria Maddox, who's a consultant with the Training Program. And you'll hear us on and off throughout the webinar this morning, and we'll also be monitoring the chat box to make sure that everybody's experience is.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. This is Ami Santos, and this is just a reminder to make sure that for those of you who are on the seminar today, obviously, to keep either your smartphone handy or something to remind you about some of the things that we'll be talking about today. We want to either have you tweet something that you might have heard that you think would be good to share with others, share it on Facebook, let people know, set up a reminder for yourself, all the things that would help you kind of take what you gained today to your work and and extend it beyond today. All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Michaelene Ostrosky, also one of the presenters. So Ami and I will tell you a little bit about ourselves, and we'll tell you a little bit about Yusuf. Those of you who are new to this webinar series on behavior, my family is the one on the top picture on the left-hand side, and that is my son, who is now 15 and is now 6'3", but that's when he was born, and we spent 11 days in the NICU, being a premature baby and having some complications at birth. I'm a former teacher of adults with severe disabilities and also young children who were deaf and blind. So working with families with those two groups of individuals was something I spent a lot of time doing in my early part of my career as far as being a teacher. Also then as far as my research career for the last 25 years being out in the field and working in classrooms has always, and with pre-K and early intervention, has always focused on social, emotional, and challenging behavior for much of my career. So I'm really thrilled to be here and be a part of these 3 seminars on behavior. So I'll turn it over to Ami. And that's me with my daughter, who is now 9 years old. And I do a lot of my work and research around working with families, in particular, really trying to figure out how to conduct services to families who may not share the same background as you as a professional, and so that's kind of been my big area and interest. I have been, as a parent, on the receiving end of caregivers talking to me about my daughter's challenging behaviors when she was particularly when she was an infant, because at some point, as you could imagine, when she was about a year old, she started biting her friends, and so that was something that it was very interesting to kind of get that perspective of how, what makes it an effective interaction between a caregiver or a provider and the parent, and especially for those moments that are very challenging for both parent and the child. Yeah. And so you might guess that in the photo to the right is Yusuf, our co-preparer, I'll say, and that is when we were at the DEC conference in St. Louis this past year. So Yusuf is a PhD student from Turkey who finished his master's over at Oregon. He's very interested in working with families, especially around young children's social, emotional, social communication skill development. He's done a lot of work with families of children with autism. And Yusuf helped us prepare today's session, but then he had a stats class today, and being the consummate professors that we are, Ami and I said to him, don't miss stats class, we'll do the presentation. So anyway, Yusuf is sitting in a stats class, maybe wishing he was here doing this presentation with us. So
That's him, and his email's at the end of the session, as is both Ami and mine, as are both Ami and mine, should you need to contact us afterwards. Okay, so let's get started, and we'll talk about what are our objectives for today. So Ami and Yusuf and I both feel like, and I'm sure you'll agree since 121 of you are on this session, that bringing up the topic of challenging behavior or problematic behavior with parents of infants and toddlers, sometimes it can feel like you're walking on a partially frozen pond. You might be thinking, you know, how do I broach this subject? What does discipline or problem behavior look like in the birth to 3 range? And then how do I collaborate with families and with my other team members around problem behavior, especially if you're spending, you know, limited amounts of time with the family, maybe an hour a week, maybe, you know, a little bit of time every couple weeks. So in this webinar, what we hope is that you'll learn some strategies. We have 5 strategies we've targeted and that we'll walk through throughout the webinar, and that will help ease your comfort in discussing behavioral concerns with family members and work toward really collaborative planning. So that's our idea, is problem solving, collaborative planning with families of infants and toddlers and with other team members. So that's our goal. So when we think about what is challenging behavior, the way, or kind of the framework that Ami and I use is that they're behaviors that interfere with optimal learning or engagement in a child and infant toddler's interactions with both peers and with adults. Almost every family has experienced a time when their child behaves in ways that seem very different from his or her usual behavior. And there are many times that as we raise young children, as we interact with families of infants and toddlers, that challenging behavior can seem confusing, can seem inappropriate, can seem frightening. So we may be kind of at our wits' end, too, of even how to help figure out what's going on. So let's listen to a couple families' voices and think about the emotions as I read these quotes to you. So starting with the one on the right-hand side, we have had an episode where we went to a friend's house, and we haven't seen them since. I was so mortified. We're still twitching. It was just that other kids have temper tantrums or whatnot, but they tend to calm down quicker, and it's not just as disruptive. And because his are so violent and so much longer, it makes everybody twitch. So you can just imagine, you know, how appalled, how embarrassed, how that family felt, and then the fact that they haven't seen their friends since then, you know, how that impacts their relationships and going out in the community, or their perceived, you know, ability to go out in the community with their child. And then the one to the left definitely inhibits our ability to go out in the community. Our restaurants are the fast food ones only. Any place where we can pay first and then leave. Any place that has a quick exit. Lenny is unpredictable, and he's destructive, not only to our family unit, but to people around him. Things like movies. We cannot normally take him. So we can, you know, imagine parents saying such things. Maybe these are familiar to you. These kind of quotes are things that you've heard from other family members. And then you can have to consider, okay, how do I respond when a family talks to me about things like this? So our framework for the social and emotional work that we do is based on the fact that we believe that social emotional development and behavior is promoted through positive preventative measures. So trying to think about what can we do to prevent challenging behavior from occur. And that most children's behavior and development doesn't require intensive intervention, that there are many things that we can do prior to doing a functional behavior assessment or some of the more intensive kind of interventions that might be required. So we want to do a little poll. So go back to the left-hand corner where the little polls are. We want you to answer this true or false question. While it is important to find meaning in children's behavior, it's not so important for adults to be aware of the meaning in their own behavior. True or false?
We'll give folks about 10, 15 seconds to respond. Make sure you're using the poll function, the 4th icon right under your name, to open that poll, and you'll have a choice of yes or no there. Getting lots of responses coming in. A few more seconds here. All right. Let's see. There we go. Let's see how they responded. Overwhelming response feel that the answer is false. Mickey and Ami?
Well, those of you that who responded false, you're absolutely correct. So let's think for a minute to kind of this comment, that children often use their behavior to tell us what they need. And adults can help children by figuring out the meaning behind the child's behavior. Okay, so think about that. Children are using behavior to tell us what they need, where they need help, what they want access to, and we can then figure out the meaning behind their behavior. But also, it's as important to find out, as important as it is to find out the meaning in children's behavior, it's equally important for us to be aware of the meaning in our own behavior. So how we react to the child. What are we saying? What kind of meaning is behind our behavior? Are we angry? Are we telling the child it's okay to do this or it's not okay to do that? And we'll talk some about that. So consider that all children, but most especially those who display challenging behavior, need consistency. So they need the consistency of a reliable and loving adult who provides support and guidance, especially during difficult times. Okay, so to better understand what a child may be communicating through challenging behavior, it's really important that we gather information. We need to think about the where, the when, with whom challenging behavior occurs, to notice patterns when behavior occurs, and for that adult then to provide consistency, and also, be a reliable, loving adult who supports the child and is teaching the child and supporting them during those difficult times. So think carefully about a child's day, their day in childcare, their day at home, other places where challenging behavior occurs, and then we'll think about how the child may be communicating when he or she engages in challenging behavior in those settings. And in order to do that, the adult will need to gather some information. So I'm going to turn it over to Ami, and she's going to really try to situate our work with families in the early childhood, early intervention landscape so we can move further along with the topic.
All right, so for those of you who have participated in the last two, or at least one of the webinars that we've done around behavior, you've seen these next couple of slides, that it's really just a reminder for all of us to know that in our own profession, whether we're speech therapists or OTs or PTs or DTs or social work, we do have our practices that are that dictates pretty much how we go about working with families. And we know in early intervention that working with families, we really need to really consider how we view families' participation, how we want to make sure that that they're actively involved in making any kind of decisions that happen from assessment to intervention and back again. We want to make sure that there's they do take the lead in developing the plan, and if you get to the point where you're working with the families in developing a plan to address some of the children's challenging behaviors, that they are fully involved and engaged in those activities, in those planning. For many of you, if you would know that the early intervention principles are the ones that guide what we do in our work with birth to 3, and so in our mission is to make sure that we provide the support and resources to assist the family members and caregivers, because they're the ones who are with their children 24/7, trying to provide them with the support that they need to develop and also to address some of the challenging behaviors that they may be experiencing at this point. So just to kind of, again, talk a little bit about some of the ways that we look at challenging behaviors for young children. In the past, what we would have seen as, generally what people would have done, the old ways, what we would say, call it, is that when we look at the ways that we would address some of these challenging behaviors, is that we generally would intervene for all behaviors without any consideration for whether it's whining or crying or hitting. That we always think about just one general intervention generally for addressing all behaviors. But now we know from research from our practices that we really have to think about intervention and to address specific behaviors, looking at the purpose and function of those challenging behaviors, and we'll go through that today. But we wanted to make sure that you that this is kind of like you have an understanding of where our premise is. The old way also is looking at that when we see challenging behaviors, that what happens is we tend to be more reactive in those situations. And now, what we know from research is that prevention is really the most effective way of addressing challenging behaviors. It's really being more proactive, really trying to help children to, we know that they have challenging behaviors. We learn about what their triggers are. How can then we be more supportive of them so that those triggers, they're able to kind of go through those without having to hurt themselves or hurt others or engage in other types of challenging behaviors. In the past, we looked at looking at the frequency and intensity of the behaviors, and what our goal is just make him stop crying, just make him stop, doing all these, like hitting his little brother or biting. And now the focus is on really looking at how can we teach new skills to children, and how can we make sure that the behaviors that we're seeing are replaced by behaviors that we would like to see that kids do, that are appropriate and that are developmentally age appropriate for these kids. The last thing is that in the old way, we look at intervention as something that we would do short term and a quick fix. We still want to do that. We just want them to stop crying. We just want them to be able to soothe themselves. But many of these challenging behaviors, especially the ones that we're really addressing for young children with disabilities in our work, intervention is a long-term process. And we have to walk with the parents, walk with the families that we work with through this process, because it is a long-term process and it's not a quick fix for many of them. So the first, so now we're going to go through the 5 strategies that we've kind of pulled together to address some of these challenging behaviors. So what we wanted to we kind of did a general heading for each of these strategies, and that is we have to really understand the behaviors so that we can better support what parents are seeing and hearing when they're with their child or their children who are engaging in these behaviors. So the very first thing that we want to do is really be able to conduct careful observations. And when we talk about careful observations, we mean that careful observations of you as a provider looking at what's happening in the home, as well as then helping parents become better observers of their children's behavior as well. So then what can you do? So the first thing as a provider, and then something that you might want to share with the parents as well, is really thinking about what are you seeing and hearing, and then recording it in a way that would help you remember and make sure and start seeing patterns. Because when you see just one incident, it doesn't mean that happens all the time. Now, for many providers, we know you're in the homes or you're in the setting with the family, maybe once a week, if that, or every other week. So it's not like you're there, you're seeing them 24/7, seeing them at bedtime or nap time or during meals or bath time, when that's when the challenging behaviors are occurring. And so what's really important is really finding ways to kind of record what the parents are seeing, what they're hearing, especially those times when you're not in their homes. And then how do you do that? So you might encourage them to take some kind of, write some anecdotes for you, video might also help. Now with the smartphone, use these technologies to your advantage in making sure that they're able to capture some of these moments, especially the ones that you can't see because you're not there at that time. The other key thing to remember about observations is being objective and really just looking at the facts. It's really hard to know, especially for these situations, because people get really, really emotional. My daughter, when she starts breaking down into, going into a tantrum, my husband's initial reaction to her is that he would try to counter her tantrums by trying to shout or raise his voice louder than hers, which it doesn't help in that situation. And so what you want to do is really try to move away from some of the emotions out of it and really thinking about what is going on and be as objective as you can. The other thing to remember is that making sure that you use all 5 senses when you're doing observations. See what's happening around you, hear what's happening. If there's some, if a child's reacting during mealtime, what is going on? Why is it that they're spitting this out, or why are they turning their head away, or why are they see their food and they start crying? What's going on with their clothes? Why is it that they're very unhappy? So feel and smell, all these things are really important when you start really looking at children's challenging behaviors and what's going on. The other key thing, and this goes back to what the true or false question that we had earlier, is this notion about really looking at how are people reacting to this child once they engage in challenging behaviors. What is the response? How are they feeling, and how are they reacting to this child? And it's really important to remember that the children's behaviors, and we'll talk about this later, are really are reinforced by what's happening in their environment. So if a parent is picking up a child or doing something with the child once they engage in those challenging behaviors, at some point that behavior is being reinforced, whether negatively or positively. And so we need to understand what's going on. Are the other children, the little children that are in this child's daycare program, are they all running away from her because she's biting everyone? How are they reacting? How are the child care providers reacting when this child starts to bite? This one, the last note, I know it's difficult for us providers because we have specific days or times that we can go visit families, and usually it's the same day or same time that we see them. But to the extent possible, if you can find a way to collect some information from the parent on, okay, tell me more about bath time. Tell me more about what happens during when you're trying to get him to bed, and have them really walk you through that moment, especially when the child is engaging in challenging behaviors, is really, really important. Okay, so if you look at this picture, and I'd love to see what, if you can just, in the chat box, what do you see in this picture? So if you see this, what do you see? What emotions do you see this child telling us? And what are some of the things that you want, that you see? Okay, so somebody says cautious, shame, what else? Oh, wow, that's fast. Fear, apprehensive, I don't want to, upset, yeah, hesitant, scared, yeah, oh boy, yeah, scared, pouting, yeah. Very interesting. The key thing to remember in these situations, and Mickey, you could jump in here, is that without knowing the context, right, for this behavior, for what's happening in this picture, we don't really know what this child is really telling us, or what's happening to this child. We're always seeing a snapshot of children when we go visit them, when we see them in the context of their home, and even though we may be there for, say, 30, 45 minutes or even an hour, we're only seeing a piece of their day, of their week, when the parents are the ones that really see them most of the time. Without an understanding of the context, we don't know. Like in particular, this child here in this picture, you know, we captured this child, maybe she was playing hide and seek, you know, and really was in a playful mood, and it just so happened that this was the picture that was, you know, when the photographer snapped the picture, it just so happened that she was making this expression, but that she was trying to really hide, and she could have just broken out a big smile right after this. We don't know that. But it's really interesting because for every, you know, the response in the chat, everything seemed like this child was shy, scared, negative, you know, all these negative things. But we don't know that without the context. that of understanding what's happening around this particular situation, around this particular picture. And I think that's something that we need to remember as providers, that when we do our observations, we have to be very careful about labeling what's happening in the situation without an understanding of the context. So the key thing here is really to encourage families to share their observations with you, and for you to share your observations with family, and let families know that their observations are important and valid. And it's really interesting because I think sometimes we forget, and you know, for those of us who do research, we almost always have to fight others to say, yeah, when a parent reports something, why would they not give you the honest answer to the reporting? And it was really interesting because that's kind of like there's a little bit of a tension that happens in research when we talk about parent observations and the validity of those observations. But it's really important for you as a provider to say, okay, your observations are really important, and I really need to know what's going on. So the parent may not be seeing what you think what you're seeing, but then understand that they might have a different context for seeing those behaviors that you would have in when you're out there visiting them. All right, Nikki.
Okay, so strategy 1 that Avi just finished was kind of thinking about conducting careful observations. Now we're going to talk about the second of the 5 strategies, which is understanding ways children communicate. And also remember that in the chat, you can also post questions. So after I go through the strategy, we'll pause for a couple minutes and field some questions. So feel free, if things are kind of percolating in your head and you have some questions, jot them down in the chat. Now, what gets difficult is it's really hard if you say, I have a child who, whatever, because as Ami just said, you know, we don't see that child. We're not observing them. So, you know, we can now think about problem solving, but figuring out something for a particular child who we don't have the whole context is going to be hard in a chat room. So let's think about understanding ways that kids communicate, infants, toddlers communicate. So if we want to put infants and toddlers' behavior in the most simplistic of terms, we might consider that children are telling us, I want more, so some kind of engagement cues or disengagement cues. I need a break, so continue something or discontinue something might be the most basic of their cues. So when we think about infants and toddlers, then what are some of the cues that they give you to show that they are engaged? So just think about these in your head. And then what are some of the cues, the behaviors, that they give you to show that they're disengaged? Okay, so we're going to do a little multiple choice here. So go back to your polls up there in the left-hand corner. Which of the following behaviors do infants use to communicate with adults? Giggle, hiccup, blank stare, none of the above, all of the above.
And while you're looking, just make sure that you're using the poll function. I'm kind of drawing a line here to where you should find your poll function actually on your Blackboard here, so hopefully you'll be able to find it. And that's that 4th icon here. All right, so you should have 5 choices to choose from, and we're getting great responses. We'll give folks another few more seconds to respond. Let's see. Right, it looks like just about everybody has had an opportunity to respond, so let's see what our results are. All right, well, ladies, it looks like folks say that none of those are behaviors that infants use, or all of them. There we go, E. I look screen. I was going to say, whoa, really? Oh, me too. Wow. So most everybody unanimously agrees pretty much that all of those are behaviors that infants communicate with. So
absolutely.
Back to you, ladies.
So children use behavior to tell us what they need, and adults can then help the child by figuring out the meaning of that child, the infant toddler's behavior. And then our role, too, as providers, is to help parents then tune into the behaviors and see them as a form of communication. So helping parents see giggling as a form of communication, a blank stare as a form of communication, hiccups as a sign of communication. And so as a provider, then our role is to kind of talk to the child and help parents see, that the child might be hiccuping. Slow down as far as, you know, how fast you're feeding me, how fast I'm shaking the bottle. I'm overstimulated in this environment. Sometimes babies will resort to hiccuping. So looking at those kind of those behaviors as being communicative. Young children, infants and toddlers, communicate in many ways. So they might look away, they might yawn, they might raise their eyebrows. Huh? They might give a blank stare. They might squeal. And again, we need to pay attention to the body language an infant toddler is giving us, and then interpret it. Interpret it to the parents, interpret it ourselves. Other ways that babies, infants, toddlers might communicate: arching their back, stiffening, lowering the head, stiffening their muscles. So we want to read the cues, we want to look for patterns, interpret what the infant toddler is telling us through their behavior. And then parents and or our own reactions as providers should be based on reading then the baby's cues, if that makes sense. So we're reading the baby's cues, and then our behavior, we're reacting to the baby in the way that we're interpreting those cues. And as we get to know the infant and toddler better, then we realize, ooh, when, you know, the baby rubs his eyes like that, he's clearly exhausted. Or when he puts his head down, he needs a break from the stimulation, or he needs to be cuddled. So we start interpreting those cues. The better we know the baby, the better the infant toddler, the better we are at then reading the baby's cues and responding in a way that meets the child's needs. So we're going to pause here for a second, a couple minutes, and Maria and Susan will, or Susan will facilitate questions, and Ami and I will do our best to try to answer some of those questions, as well as Maria and Susan jumping in.
Okay, so going kind of back here a little bit, it looks like Paula was curious about suggestions for situations when parents don't think that behavior is a problem, and that may be something that you're going to cover later. In context of, you know, sometimes the issue might be cultural, or maybe it's a perception that boys behave differently than girls. So I don't know if that's something you're going to cover later, or if that's something you can address now.
Yeah, I think, so this is Ami. So one of the things we need to remember about challenging behaviors, it's really in the eyes of the beholder, right? So what you may see as challenging, I may not see as challenging. I may have a higher tolerance for screaming children. Others may not. I remember when my daughter would cry, and I could not stand it. I just have to, like, I was there. My heart was breaking. I was like crying with her, and my husband had a longer tolerance for letting her cry for a little bit and let her, whine for a little bit before we pick her up. And it was very interesting, and just even within a family, that there is a difference in how we view challenging behaviors. So I think one of the key things to remember when the parent is not viewing one as a challenging behavior, it doesn't mean that they're ignoring it or that they're avoiding it, but really thinking through, like, why is it that, what's the context? Why are they not seeing it? If the child is hurting other kids, why do they not see that as something that's not bad? And so talking with the parents, talking through with these situations with them, trying to gain an understanding, gain their perspective on what it is that they're seeing or not seeing, will help you better understand, okay, this is, or maybe even help them understand why that child's behavior is not acceptable. We'll go through, in the next strategy, we'll talk about developmental milestones. Oftentimes parents are not even aware of what might be appropriate for young children or not, and so their expectations of children's behavior might be a little different than our own expectations, just because we may have taken, a course or studied more around developmental milestones.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, I think you could go the other extreme too, like crying, even roughhousing. You know, in some families, kids kind of roughhousing and wrestling and loud noise. It never bothered me. Kids running around the house or yelling and being engaged, whereas other parents might have less of a tolerance for that. Even toddlers being loud and noisy and, high, what some might interpret as high energy. That kind of stuff never bothered me. But for some family members, it's more kind of be quiet and sit and play quietly. So, okay, another question, Maria?
Okay. Rabia had a question about how important it is to set goals with families within therapy sessions related to behavior.
I think it's a great idea. I think if parents express any kind of concerns to you, or you see something that you want to at least bring up and see if it's a concern, and then how you broach it is, of course, the critical piece. But absolutely, I think it's a great idea of things we want to work on, just like we might work on feeding goals or other types of goals, communication goals. Behaviors closely linked to communication, challenging behaviors. So I think absolutely you should.
Yeah, I think one of the, and we don't have this slide here, but one of the slides I always think about is the slide that we use in our other trainings is the one where we say, okay, if a child doesn't know how to, eat, we teach them how to do that. If a child doesn't know how to, drive, or a teenager how to drive, we teach them to do that. If a child doesn't know how to read, we teach them how to read. But then if a child doesn't know how to behave, we end up punishing, teaching. I mean, and it's really interesting because we never really think about social emotional development as an area of development of something that we would be really addressing as in teaching. If you teaching, and I'm using this in a very broad context, not like teaching in a classroom kind of thing, but that we need to address these things and use them and think about goals to address these, to help children learn and more about social emotional development and help them facilitate their development around this area.
And someone just put in the chat room about prioritizing goals, and I think that's really important. So a parent could, come to you and say, I'm so frustrated. She whines when she does this, and she hits when she does this, and she has temper tantrums at this time. So helping them focus in on, let's start at one place. So what's the biggest concern? Maybe it's the bedtime routine, the nap time routine. Maybe it's the biting as opposed to the whining. I think it's a great idea if it seems like there are so many things. Where can we start? Let's pick a starting place. Baby steps, as someone said.
We've probably got one or two more questions here. I just want to share that Kay and Mary kind of just shared the thought that parents do see their children as reflections of themselves, which I think we all see that as well. And Karen had a question. It was more of a specific question, but I think it can be generalized about recognizing children who have certain behaviors and all of a sudden they've changed, and some of that just may be related to development. But I think the concern really, the overall concern is, what about children whose behaviors just change, where they used to be happy with doing certain things and now they're not.
So one of the things that we really, again, it goes back to that whole notion of context. What is going on? So a sudden change in behavior tells you that there's something that would have happened, right? And it's not like you're going to go in there and pry, but clearly being a good provider means being a good detective about on what's happening around families and children and understanding what's causing the change. And I'm not saying this for every child, but one of the things to remember is that traumatic events that are often under diagnosed in young children, but often also is the biggest predictor of some of these behavioral changes that seem unexplained. It could just them be witnessing something. It doesn't have to have happened to them, but it could just be something that's happening in the home or in their community or in their neighborhood. And so that's one of the things I would probably kind of think about, like, was something happened, or maybe that just grandma moved out or grandma passed away. It doesn't have to be like a big, bad thing, but it is, or somebody in their family got diagnosed with, a terminal disease or something like that. That's causing everybody to kind of turn their attention towards that person, and then now this child is left alone and doesn't get the kind of care or attention that they used to get. And so, of course, that's very, suddenly there's a change in their routines, and so then it changes them also. So I think really thinking about what's going on and being a good detective and finding out what's happening within that family.
Looks like as far as like specific questions, we may have covered most of them. There's a lot of good sharing of strategies and communication in the chat box, but I think we're safe to move on to the next section.
All right, okay. So the third strategy that we want to talk about is about really understanding and helping is knowing children's social, emotional, and developmental milestones. And it's not just for us to know that, and I'm hoping that for you as a provider that you are fully aware of that. It's easy for us to remember how, especially if we have children of our own in the home, of how, what we saw when our own children were growing up. But then it's also easy for us to forget what the real expectations are for young children as they grow. And so for parents, especially for first-time parents, for young parents, for any parent, developmental milestones are not something that they would not necessarily have handy right there. And so it's really helping them understand what are some of these developmental milestones that they need to remember and understand that will help them understand their children's behaviors. So how does knowing social emotional milestones help you build those relationships? And the key thing to remember here is that if we know what to expect of most children at a certain age, at those ages, it's easier for us then to work with parents to facilitate, to guide them and provide input to them as they traverse through this childhood life of the life of their child, and thinking about, okay, it's okay. Biting at this age, it's okay. It's a form of communication. How can we make sure then that this child doesn't hurt or can learn other strategies that would help her communicate that she doesn't want another kid to take away a toy from her. And so instead of biting, what else can she do? So in the case for my daughter, when she started biting when she was about 16 months old, and it was in a child care, and the teacher the provider came to me and asked me about it, and so I went into the room and started observing what was going on, and I found that it was happening when other children were coming to her and wanting to take a toy that she might have, and even though she can talk at that age, the other kids were not able to really understand when she says no. And so the fastest way for her to communicate no to those other kids was to bite them. And boy, that sure worked, because they were just out of her space in a heartbeat. But that wasn't going to always work, because then at that point in any given day there might be 3 kids with bite marks going home from my daughter, and it was very challenging to think about, okay, how can we do this, knowing that it's appropriate at that for her age, but then how can we replace that behavior? So one of the things that we did teach her was that to walk away. So we had her little mantra of, I don't bite, I walk away. And really walking away meant going to find an adult to help protect her from the other kids who were trying to take her toys. And that really worked, and that pretty much staved off the biting at that point. So here's a little multiple choice activity for you. So if you think about some of the social emotional behaviors that are typical for infants, and we're talking about birth to 15 months, which of these are typical for infants, birth to 15 months? So Maria's put the prompt in there.
So yes, using that icon, that 4th icon, to respond to the chat, to the poll, that would be great. You should have 5 choices from A to E. We'll give folks a few seconds to respond. We're getting a lot of responses in. Appreciate your participation with this. Let's see. Give folks a few more seconds. We're getting a lot. We're seeing an overwhelming theme kind of showing up here. Okay, I think we're probably close so we could move on and see our results. So, what did folks say? Well, again, overwhelming, a very large portion agreed that all of those are typical social emotional behaviors. So 74%.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is indeed the correct answer, at least for this poll. That when the children do engage in these behaviors, and for infants in particular, and that they are typical for many children, but yet when we and if parents don't know what to expect of their children, it's harder for them to say, oh, but I don't understand why they're not gazing. Oh, I think they're just not wanting to pay attention to me, or or I don't understand why they just kind of sit still or they're just sitting still. They're very being good babies, and they're not hitting or kicking objects, and or this little toy in their crib, and you're going, well, let's think about this, because we know that for young children, for infants in particular, these are some of the things that we would be expecting them to do. So one of the handouts that you all would have access to at the end of our webinar here are, and I mean handouts like they're links, are these indicators are for social emotional development for birth to 15 months old, and then also for 12 to 2.5 years old. These are just sampling. This is just a sampling. So there's you can see that there's a citation that you can get the full copy of some of these skills that children engage in at those ages, and I think it's important for us as providers to know that being bossy when you're between 1 year and 2 years old is pretty normal, because that's when they really begin to develop self-awareness. Saying no to adults is pretty normal, and it's important that we honor some of these things for young children, but also recognizing that that is a word that's one of the very first words that they learn. And so it's really important for us to remember when they're in in those moments that some of these things are going to be okay. So when we think about, again, challenging behaviors, though, we think about the duration, the intensity, and the frequency of some of these behaviors. So a child who might say no, I would often, but not that often, and not in extreme situations, it may just be exhibiting typical behaviors for children their age, and that's okay. And so, but I think helping parents understand some of these milestones, making sure that you understand them yourself, is really important in working when you work with parents. So one of the things to really think about with young children is that as children grow, and we know this especially between the birth to 3 age range, is that their development is so quick and so fast and so different, from month to month to month. I mean, sometimes even from day to day to day, it's so different. But then as they develop, new challenges may emerge for young children. So, it's so funny, because one of the things that we talk about is like, oh, we can't wait for these little babies to walk. But then we know that once they start walking, there's going to be a different challenge, because you're going to be chasing them around. Or you might say, oh, I really like it where, I'd like to be able to, so that they could just stand on their own, so I don't have to carry them around. But now they're climbing your couch or your TV stand or whatever it is that they're doing. But those are challenges that emerge, that come with the development of children. Some of the challenging behaviors occur because some of these development has not yet occurred. So some of the language might be happening at a later time, particularly for kids with disabilities. And so if they're not able to communicate verbally, vocally, some of their needs, their fears, their wants, they may engage in challenging behaviors to let you know, I'm scared, or I'm thirsty, or I'm hungry. And so some of these things happen, some of these challenging behaviors happen because they have not developed some of those skills. And so it's important then for us as providers to say, okay, what can we do to facilitate some of these skills to be learned at that point? The other thing is that we know that development creates means that there needs to be a shift in how we would provide support to young children. So an infant who sleeps, eats, poops, on a day-to-day basis is going to have very different needs than a 2-year-old who does far more things than a newborn infant. And so our caregiving relationship, the way that we would engage with the children is going to be very, very different in those situations. So how you would address challenging behaviors with very, very young children, with infants, is going to be slightly different from how you would engage, how you would address their challenging behaviors when they're about 2 years old.
That makes me think, Ami, of how many parents, like as their child's becoming 2 or so, say it takes so long to get out the door because now the child wants to try to put on some things by themselves, or the young preschooler who, I want to do it myself. I want to try to put on my shoes or socks, or I don't want that coat. So, sometimes those things then present real challenges because the child's becoming more independent.
Yes.
So this next strategy just flows naturally from the one Ami just talked about, of knowing, the importance of knowing social emotional development, and that is understanding the relationship then between social emotional development and behavior, that, all the developmental domains are linked to one another. So knowing and paying attention to that relationship. Oops, can you move that? Sorry, no more. That's okay. Okay, so behavior has meaning and is communicating a message. So a smile may mean, and you could fill that, in with, it might mean a child's happy, a child's pleased, a child's glad to see you. 2 arms stretched up may mean pick me up, I need a hug. Pointing to a bottle might mean I'm hungry, there's my bottle. You asked them, where's my bottle? They pointed to it. Then, some other, when we think about then challenging behavior, the 3-month-old screams and cries for long periods of time. Why? Because maybe they're hungry, maybe they're sick, maybe they're tired, maybe something they're wearing, the feel of it. A 17-month-old hits another child, like Ami was talking about her daughter, wants a toy, trying to interact with her. The other child took her toy. A 2-year-old says no frequently because they want to do it alone. They need more time before ending one activity and beginning another. Some of these kind of behaviors might be a little more difficult to figure out. So some of the basics we want to think about and we want to remember as we talk to parents about behavior and family members about behavior is that behavior has meaning. So if nothing else, when you work with families, if you can help them reframe and think about behavior that way, that the child is telling us something, is communicating to us, and depending on the child's development, where the child's at, that behavior could look differently and mean different things. And that children display what we might call challenging behavior because they don't have other skills to meet their intended needs. So if they could say to you, I'm really hungry, can I have a bottle? Then they wouldn't have to cry, right? So, or, if they could tell you, I'm not feeling so well, then they wouldn't have to cry and be whiny. We can focus on understanding behavior and meeting the child's needs and teaching the child what to do. So here's where we as providers, and also we can help parents understand what the behavior means, how to meet the child's need, and then what we can do. So as the 2-year-old is hitting, what skills can we teach the child instead? So rather than reacting to the challenging behavior as having no meaning, that the child's being naughty or trying to get our goat, if we think about the challenging behavior as having meaning, then it reframes it into, okay, like Ami's quote before about we teach a child to read, we teach a child to write, we teach a child to tie his shoes, we teach a child what skills to use in place of challenging behavior. So if you can imagine these bubbles coming out of your head, I guess, this child keeps banging her head, and the mom is not helping by giving in every time she does. So imagine you go to this home and you're seeing this happening. I don't think I can keep supporting this family. And maybe you even go on to think, maybe Walmart is hiring seasonal help. I'm sure they must be looking for people to sell swimwear and sell poolwear. But instead, if you can change and reframe your thoughts to a more calming, a more positive, a more proactive way, and think about things like, boy, this mom seems really frustrated and she's at her wit's end, so I'm seeing her, this is what's happening. I can't imagine dealing with this behavior every day. I wonder, how can I support both mom and the child? So reframe your thoughts to be more proactive, to be more solution-focused and strategy-focused. So what are some strategies for reframing? Notice your own feelings, step back. So get parents, too, to notice their own feelings. Observe the behavior. We talked about that. So pay attention to it. Look for patterns. Look for times. When does this behavior occur? When does it not occur? When am I seeing it more frequently? With who? Under what conditions? Ask I wonder questions. I wonder why this is happening. I wonder what would happen if. I wonder if I do this, what would happen? And further educate yourself about the child's age and stage of growth. So think about development and think, could that be a reason why the child is doing this? So how do I get myself or get a parent to do more reframing versus continuing in a cycle of kind of getting into upsetting thoughts? Other tips, take some deep breaths, relax, meditation, go to a little vacation spot in your head for a couple seconds, focus on what you can do. Okay, what's possible? Think about the messages of your own behavior. So Ami was talking about her husband and his voice escalating. So then what's happening? You're telling the child to stop yelling or getting upset, but your voice is escalating. You're getting upset. You're modeling then maybe the behaviors you don't really want to model. Find support. So encourage parents to talk with you, build that relationship. Seek support yourself as a provider from others within the EITP group, other interventionists, other providers you have interactions with where you can get support. Okay, so now Ami's going to talk a little bit about the fifth strategy and final strategy, and that's recognizing cultural influences on behavior.
So the key thing here, and I know we're kind of getting short on time here, so let me just be very quick, but I want to emphasize something. So in early intervention, when we're working with very young, with young children, birth to 3, the basic premise that we have with working with families is that we treat each family individually. So when you think about families that you're working with from diverse cultural backgrounds, you really are thinking about each one individually. So it's not like you have to learn about what Latino families are doing, in general. It would be good information for you to have that, but you really have to get to know the family as an individual to really be able to provide the kind of support and services that they need. So the thing to remember about culture and how it influences our behaviors is that anything and everything that we do, the way we look at the world, is really influenced by what our culture has taught us, whether it's something that's been passed down to us from our family, by our family members, by grandparents, by our parents, or something that we see, in our community, in our neighborhoods. If this is an acceptable behavior of hitting other, like little kids or things that's too extreme. If you see that parents are letting their kids run around in the playground, and it's something that's accepted by many, the families there, then that's something to consider. Not to say that that's appropriate, but I just want you to make sure to understand that those are the things that's happening in that neighborhood that's working for that particular group. One of the other key things to remember also is that infants and toddlers don't come into this world knowing what's expected of them. What happens is that these behaviors are shaped by the caregivers around them, and those caregivers are doing it based on their own culture, based on their own individual preferences. So when you are working with families, whether they're backgrounds are similar or different from yours, the most important thing to remember is really to get to know the family and get to know about their home and their community. So if you're worried about, like, okay, this family says that in their culture, spanking is okay, think about that for a moment and say, how can I know if that's really truly just that family, or is it something that is cultural? So you might want to go to the community and find out more and see what's really accepted within that community. What is being taught? What is being shared by that particular group together? And so getting to know the home as well as the community is very important when you're trying to figure out what is culture-based behavior versus something that might be more individual-based. Making sure that you support the home languages of the families, because that, again, is very important. For children, we pass down our culture to our young through our language, and that's important for us to remember that supporting home language is key to doing that. As providers, it's important for us to access cultural competency training, and I believe that EICP has many of these types of trainings that you can access as well as from other groups all over the state and in the country. Some specific ones that you could think about are, making sure that you are familiar with stories that from the family's cultures or from their home, or something that, a song or lullaby that really tells you a little bit more about their culture that you can use in your interactions with the families, and really encouraging the families to use them with their children when they're trying to engage them. Okay, look at this here.
Okay, I'm going to do, because this is a topic Ami and I love, we kind of over-prepared here a little, so we're going to skip some slides in the interest of time, because we want to give you a couple more minutes, too, if there's other questions. So let me just kind of highlight these couple slides, and then just that children are trying to send us a message when they communicate with challenging behavior, and there could be many reasons for a single behavior. So kids, infants and toddlers might be hungry and they might cry. They might be scared and they might cry. They might be tired and they might cry. So it's really up to us, like we've talked about before, of being the detective and figuring out what that child means. Sometimes children have a hard time telling adults they're angry, so they act out in ways that then in fact get them in trouble. But, really they're angry about something. They don't want this activity to end, or they need some more social interaction, some hugs, they're angry you're leaving, and then they act out because of that. And they may engage in a behavior that seems destructive, but because maybe they like the physical sensation, so they're pounding on something because there's something sensory-wise that they're trying to access. We often talk about challenging behavior as being access-oriented. Children are trying to gain access to something, or they're trying to escape from something. So it could be they're trying to gain access to social interactions or materials or sensory, or trying to escape those same kind of things. Social interaction, some kind of materials or activity, or something sensory. So, how to build relationships with families. Some of this we've talked about as we discussed each strategy, that respecting and remembering that the child's first and primary teacher is the family, so we're working in partnership with them. And as we support that parent-child relationship, that's one of the most important roles that a caregiver has. And as providers, that's our role, is to try to help enhance that. Caring for infants and toddlers means we're then caring for the whole family. So when we collaborate with families around challenging behavior, there are then critical things to remember. Communicating consistently with families, offering, thinking about multiple ways, what's the best way to share information, inviting conversations. So some of you asked, there's how to set goals, how to, if you think your behavior is challenging but the family hasn't brought it up, inviting those conversations, which means you're relationships. You've developed relationships. You're developing relationships with the infant or toddler, and you're developing relationships with the adults. Respecting the family's views and child-rearing beliefs and habits, which Ami talked about, and then constantly checking in with the family. So thinking about what kind of feedback, seeking feedback gathering feedback, from the family. So checking in, how's it going? We talked about working on bedtime routine. Since you were struggling with that, how's it going this week? So finding that out. Highlighting the child's strengths and needs too. So finding out from the family, what are the child's strengths? What are the child's interests, so that you can then think about how to address the challenging behavior based on what the child's strengths that he or she brings to this relationship, what his interests are. Asking the families questions about their child, but also then asking the families as partners, so to help, to work together, to collaborate together as partners on skill development. And finally, getting to know the parents, each family member, really as individuals. So what does this family member think versus this one, if there are multiple family members within the home, and sharing observations. So what are the strengths, the child's needs, the child's interests that you observe when you're in the home or going to a child care center, if that's the case, and you're working with providers there? What are some of the observations that you see going on? Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Amina to finish out the webinar with a couple key points and some resources.
Okay, and I want to make sure that we can try to address the question here that's come up in a minute. But I just wanted to share this PowerPoint slide with you. We won't go through it, but I just want to say that these are different ways, different questions that you might use to help parents and help you find patterns in children's behaviors. So kind of, as you know, we talk about being a detective. Here are some questions that you can ask that can help you get to some of the root of the problems or the challenging behaviors that you or the parent might be seeing within the child. And so, again, you'll have access to these PowerPoint after this webinar, and so you can just go back to this particular slide if you're wanting to see some example of questions that you could use when you go and next time you meet with the parents. And then finally, the key takeaway message that we have here is really relationship, relationship, relationship. Building that relationship with the families, sustaining that relationship with the families, and making sure that those relationships continue to grow also. As children's needs change, the parents' needs are going to change, and so therefore what you can do to maintain that relationship is also change some of how you would relate to the parents. So,
did you understand?
Okay. Okay, so then these are some of the resources that are available online and for free. So we have a couple of groups that we've pulled information from, and this is from TAXI, which is one of our national organizations, national TNPA groups that provide support around social emotional development and challenging behaviors. And this has a lot of really good information for you as a provider to learn more about the topic, as well as something that you might be able to share with families. Some of these handouts are really beautifully done. They're almost like parent magazine kind of things with lots of beautiful pictures and really easy to access kind of information. And then other resources that are out there that also might be really helpful. So even going to some of the mainstream kind of websites like pbs.org has lots of really good information that I think would be very helpful and useful for families.
Okay, so we did see one last question that we'll address briefly and then turn it back to Susan and Maria. That was, how do you broach the discussion maybe, or what do you say to families who you see reinforcing a challenging behavior? So imagine a child who hits and then the parent picks the child up, or a child who whines and the parent then gives in to what the child has or wants. And I think if you can help parents see the cycle of this, that, we, in some of our work, we'll talk about antecedent behavior consequence, ABC. So what happens before the behavior, then the behavior occurs, and what's the consequence? And those things are all related. So if you tell the child, say, okay, it's time to leave child care, we need to go, you're picking the toddler up at child care, it's time to leave, and the child whines, and then you say, okay, you can have a couple more minutes. You can help the parent see how those things are related. Then the child may whine more, and because he or she knows, if I whine, it starts to be linked or attached to, Mom will let me stay a little bit longer. If you can help the parent say, to understand that if you come in and then give a warning in 1 minute or finish this part of playing with that toy, or let's put this toy away, then we're going to leave. So you change what happens before the behavior, and then the behavior, you say it's time to leave now, and then we actually have the consequence and we leave. You can start breaking that cycle of a challenging behavior being reinforced by something that you don't want to occur all the time. I think it's an important thing to talk about. If you see that happening, or when you talk to the parent, they say, oh yeah, but when I put him to bed, he whines some, so then I go in and lay with him. If you want to do that, that's fine, but you're starting to set it up that whining means they expect, the toddler expects you're going to come in now and lay in the toddler bed with him until he falls asleep, and how those patterns then are created. So I'll stop there. We can certainly we'll have more webinars in the future, so these have been hot topics around behavior, so clearly there's a need, and we can